In 1920, my grandfather, John Emsley May, who was a farmer, he sold all of his farms and retired and came to Bloomington and bought a house that sit right here where this building is for $2,000. My grandfather died in 1926. My dad, who was one of 10 children, he asked all of his brothers and sisters, would you like to buy this property? They said, oh, no, let's sell it and get our money. My dad said, well, I'd like to buy it. So he said, tell me what you got to have for it. Well, they came up with a price of $5,800. My dad went to the bank, borrowed the money, and bought it. And then in 1933, he bought the property in 1929. But in 1933, the Depression was on. My dad lost his job, so he started a restaurant right here in that old house, something to make a living. And then in 1941, there was a house sitting right here in property. He bought that. He paid $5,000 for that property. In 1933, my dad started a restaurant in the old house called May's Cafe. In time, he kept expanding it out. He had a dance hall where he played the jukebox for a nickel. The kids would come in, put a nickel in the jukebox, buy a Coke for a nickel, and they'd dance. And many kids used the May's Cafe as their meeting place. And he, at one time, had a little penny slot machine until they made that illegal. And he never would allow anybody to drink alcoholic beverages in his place. If they came in with a bottle, he said, you either let me hold the bottle till you leave, or you can leave now. So they'd let him hold the bottle, and then he'd give it to them as they left. If they didn't, if they started an argument, now my dad was 5'7", but he was tougher than nails, and he's kicked a few of them out of there, big guys, out of the restaurant because of he didn't want any rowdy people in his restaurant. One time, a man came in and said, I want to see your books. He was an IRS man. And my dad said, well, you know, and my dad was a great kidder. He said, I always kept the books on the bedroom wall. And he said, my wife, I left one time and my wife papered over it. I don't really have any books now. So the man started, he said, well, sit down, I want to ask you some questions. He asked him about his income and this paying out and all that. Well, we got all done. He said, okay, you owe $35. And my dad paid him $35. And he said, now listen, get yourself a bookkeeper and you keep your books on this place. My dad said, well, $35 is cheaper than a bookkeeper. He said, no, that don't work. He said, you got to have a bookkeeper. So from then on, once a year, now my dad only had an 8th grade education and really wasn't up to keeping books. So once a year, he would get Norm Neely, his attorney, and they'd sit upstairs in the living room. My dad lived upstairs in this building, and they would have a tall bottle, long neck bottle they called it, and they'd sit there and Norm would ask him questions and he'd write stuff down and this and that. And he filled out his whole year's papers in one session, and that's just about the time the bottle run out. And but my dad never did keep books. That's the way they did it for years until I started keeping the books, and then I kept them all pretty good records of it. But for many years, he and Norm Neely did it one day a week out of the year, and that worked out pretty good for him. Every once in a while, somebody will say, how long you been in Bloomington? And I'd tell them, I used to ride my tricycle on the sidewalk right out in front here. And I've lived here all my life, either lived here or had a business here, had I had something to do with this corner from 1928 when I was born until 2016 when I've sold it. The Walnut Street, when they did blacktop, back in the 30s, they blacktop this Walnut Street. It had to sit for a week before anybody could drive on it. Not that way today, but back then it had to sit. So all us kids that had bicycles, we'd ride up and down Walnut Street, not worry about any cars, because there weren't many anyway. In 1948, they started building this building here, and they finished it in 1949. Ed Leverson was the first one to move in February of 1949. His business was there for 62 years. Next door, Harry Rote started a carpet shop. He was 75 years old, but it was the first time he ever had a business of his own, and he did real well with it. We had a restaurant in this building here for 5.5 years, which was 5 years too long. I hated the restaurant business. And then we had our ice cream store opened up May the 17th, 1949, right out of this side window, which we now have put a door in there, but at the time it was just a window. And we had curb service, and we sold what we called frozen custard. When the government, about a few years later, came out with the fact that there was no frozen, if you called it frozen custard, you had to have eggs in your ice cream mix, and we didn't have, so we could call it ice cream if it was 10% butterfat, or soft serve if it was 5% butterfat. So for 5 years we had the restaurant and the ice cream over there. In 1952, we had a restaurant, and a young lady and her husband walked into the restaurant, sit down, and they called me over and said, "We'd like to sell you our house. My parents just died, and we got this house on Washington Street for sale." I said, "Well, how much do you want for it?" They said, $4,000. I said, "Okay, I'd like to buy it." But then I talked to my dad, and he said, "Oh, you don't want that house." He said he started telling me everything that was wrong with it, which really wasn't, but so I didn't get it. They wanted $4,000 for it, and if I had bought it then and put it with the sale of my other property, I could have got $150,000 out of it, but I could have had it paid for 15 times over by renting it through the years. But this is the one property I didn't get that I should have. Okay. And in the 50s, we had this restaurant from 1949 to 1955. And about 1952, there was a man that had a restaurant down on the square called Sixie's Restaurant. And Sixie, he was a redneck, didn't like anybody but white people, and he would not let any black people come into his restaurant. And he called all the restaurant people together and said, "I want to have a meeting." So they all went to his restaurant. My dad went, a lot of restaurant owners. And Sixie was given standing up, telling all about how didn't want black people in his restaurant and all that. And then my dad stood up and said, "Listen, anybody that comes into our restaurant will be served and served properly. And I want to have a restaurant that serves everybody." And that pretty much broke up the meeting, and everybody else left, and Sixie went out of business within 6 months. And nobody would trade there, but we had a very successful business. But since I didn't like the restaurant business, that's when we built the little stand out here. But I have had some good people come in. One night I had a black gentleman, real nice guy named Terry, and he asked me, he said, "If I were to bring my wife in here to eat, would we be embarrassed?" I said, no, we'd love to have you. Come in." So from then on, we started serving some black people, and everybody knew that we We're not prejudiced. We serve everybody, and that's the way it should be. Then in 1955, we built this building here, and we served out of it ever since. I got rid of the restaurant, which I did not like. I love the ice cream business. In 1955 is when I started the ice cream business over here. And it went well, pretty slow the first year, but each year it picked up, each year it got better, and has been a very successful business. When this building was first built, there's 18 rooms upstairs. My parents lived in 3 of them, and they had 12 rooms that they made into they called it a tourist lodge. Today it'd be a motel, but then it was a tourist lodge. And my mother ran this tourist lodge until after my dad died. See, that was from 1949 to 1960. My dad died in 1959, and in 1960, my mother remarried, went to Florida, and turned it. That's when I bought the building, and I did not like the tourist lodge. I had to have a lady up here, and I don't think she's entirely honest. Things did not go well, so I changed it all to apartments. And from that 12 tourist lodge, I got 6 apartments, 2 business rooms, and that worked out real good for me because I didn't need anybody to run it. I took care of it. So we had 6 real nice apartments. In 1960, J.O. Humphrey built, he had the Dodge garage dealership, and he closed it up, and he came to me and said he wanted to sell me this building. And I said, how much? He said, $10,000. I said, well, okay, would you sell it to me on a contract? He said, yes. So I gave him $1,000 down, and I started looking for a renter for this building. It sat empty for 18 months. I thought, man, I really made a mistake. But after 18 months, I finally found a renter for $100 a month, and it's been rented every month since then. But the rent kept going up, and the value of the building kept going up. I put a lot of money in it, and finally I sold it to Kip May, the photographer, for $175,000. And that he had it there for about 8 years, but then I sold all this real estate, and that had to go with it. And I bought the building back from Kip for $485,000. So I did well, he did well, and that building was the first one that I bought like that. And then at 114, right here, there was a house and a garage, and I bought it from a lady on a contract for $15,500. And then next building I bought was the Zonikis property. They had lived there for many years, and it was on the very corner of Smith Avenue and Washington Street, and I bought it for $12,000. I wanted the parking lot, which was an empty lot over behind that building. I wanted it real bad, and the only way to get it was to buy all of the Curry properties, which were 6 properties. I paid $135,000 for those 6 properties just to get this one property, which I now, at that time, I valued at $15,000. I bought the house in the middle, which ended up, all this property here, I paid $42,000 for it, rented it for a number of years, and the last renters I had were some college students. Well, one night they had a big party, shot a lot of fireworks. The fireworks caught the house on fire. the house burnt down, and I got $100,000 insurance, and I still had the property. So it all worked out that all this property now has really paid off. And what I did after buying those 3 houses and that all put together, in the year 2016, which was last month, September the 30th, 2016, I sold every piece of property I had here for $2,850,000. Now there's a lot of expenses out of that, but I felt I did real good with all this real estate. I run it for 24 years, and then I leased it out. At the time, it was called the Penguin. I leased it out to a young man that worked for me, and he ran it for 2 years. Then he got divorced, left town. His wife took it over. The man, she remarried, and he screwed this business up so bad. At the end of the 10-year lease, I told him that was it. And he wanted to sell me the name The Penguin back. I said, man, I give it to you to start with. And he said, no, it's worth a lot of money. I said, not to me it isn't. And so I took and changed the name to the Chocolate Moose. My wife came up with the name Chocolate Moose, which is a very good name. And ever since 1972, it's been called the Chocolate Moose. So my son, Tim, run it for 25 years, and then I leased it out to Jeff Grossnickel, and he was trying to sell insurance and run the business, and that didn't work. So he sold the business to some people who now are doing a real good job. They've built the business up to where they're expanded out, selling Chocolate Moose ice cream everywhere. So right now, they're going to tear this building down, and this is October 2016, and in November they're going to tear down everything and build a 4-story apartment house here, and on the lower level they're going to have room for the Chocolate Moose. And so they'll be in a new building, same location, but a wonderful product. You're going to see a lot of changes here in the next 2-3 months. So that pretty much ends my part of the story, and I will be out of it. I will have nothing except money in the bank, which is nice.
Lander, what'd you get?
Grasshopper cookie dough.
Wow. Christoph, what'd you get?
That's right.
Wow.